On today's Locked On Jayhawks, who will be the most improved KU basketball player for the 2024-25 season?
You are Locked On Jayhawks, your daily podcast on the Kansas Jayhawks. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
I'm Derek Johnson. You can find me on Twitter at DJohnsonRadio, and you can find our show. It's called Locked On Jayhawks anywhere you get your podcast, including on our YouTube page where you can like and subscribe to the show. And on today's edition of Locked On Jayhawks, we're talking which KU basketball player will take the biggest leap from last season. Thanks for the everydayers tuning into each and every show. And on today's episode, we will also get into a conversation of how many double-digit scores will Kansas have and who would be those players on this episode of the show, which is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply with Game Time. All right, let's start right here. Which Kansas basketball player will take the largest leap from last season? So, this is something where we see players all across college sports, across college basketball, across KU get better from one year to the next. That is not a new thing that happens. But it becomes a little bit more interesting to have this conversation because for Kansas, I don't know that there is an obvious candidate here. So let's go through the candidate of the returning guys, and then we'll get to who the pick is and why. You could talk about Dajuan Harris, right? Because Dajuan Harris is, I don't know, he has a chance to maybe bounce back, I guess you would say a little bit. Like I thought Dajuan Harris's 2023 season was better than his 2024 season. But part of that was based on just the fit around him. Now, if the roster is a better fit around him, which I think it will be this season, then he could just be better. But is that really him being better? Or is that just the fit is better and he's the same player? And it does feel a little bit like the last couple of seasons, like Dajuan is who he is. And that's not a bad thing. Like we know Dajuan, when he has the right fit around him, can be an excellent defender, can be an excellent passer, can set people up, and can really put the rest of the team, when you have the right pieces around him, into their perfect spots for them to excel at the best level possible for them. So but it feels like it is exactly what it is. I am careful in saying that and doing that though, because I do remember going into, and this lesson will hold with me forever, like Frank Mason going into his senior season, which, shout out Frank and what they're doing during the TBT right now. But in that he was a rotational player as a freshman, then both his sophomore and junior seasons were pretty much the same. Like they were solid seasons. They were all Big 12, I think like second and third team, something like that. Like he was a good player. But it felt like, what is the next level here? And I remember going into Frank's senior season being like, because you saw at the end of what would have been Devontae Graham's sophomore season, so going into Devontae's junior season, like some big blow-up performances where it was like, oh, is Devontae going to be, the dude on next year's team? Or is Josh Jackson going to be the dude on next year's team? Ended up Frank was the National Player of the Year winner, won every single National Player of the Year. He went from being a good player to being the best player in the country. I'm not saying that's going to happen with Dajuan Harris, but don't underestimate that even though we've seen similar levels of Dajuan Harris, I would say the last 3 seasons at KU, doesn't mean there's not a level you can go to. And maybe it's a little bit different because in the case of Dajuan, you're talking about a 6-year player. So the differences between year 4, year 5, year 6 are probably not going to be as pronounced as somebody going from year 2, year 3, year 4. But we've seen it before, not just with Frank, but just in terms of that senior year or that final year, making that final jump, right? We saw it from, even though Jalen Wilson was technically still like a 4th-year junior or something like that, or a 4th-year sophomore or 4th-year junior or something like that in his last year. We all knew it was going to be his last year at KU, and he took that big jump. Kevin McCullough took a big jump last season. Obviously, he had to deal with some injuries. Devontae Graham was a first-team All-American in his final season, taking that jump. I mentioned Frank Mason. We see guys take that jump in their final season all the time. Maybe that could be Dajuan Harris. What about KJ Adams? I mean, going in line with that final year ride, big jump at KU, that would certainly apply to KJ Adams. Now, what would that look like for KJ? And I think that's part of it with Dajuan. Like, what would that look like for Dajuan to be the most improved player? I guess the scoring, like, could he even get to 10 points per game, right? That would be a couple points increase. The assist to turnover would still be good, but it would be more in line with the year 2 years ago than it would be for last season. The defensive numbers and the defensive impact would have to be more in line with 2 seasons ago than this season. And then the 3-point shooting would probably have to go up. Maybe you take an extra 3 per game and you're shooting 38-40% from 3. For KJ, you would have to probably go from averaging 12, 4, and 3 basically to averaging, maybe you can get up to like 14 points per game, 15 points per game. And what happens if, like, KU does have enough spacing with AJ Storr, Ryland Griffin, that it opens up driving lanes to where KJ just is this unstoppable driver of the basketball, and he's shooting 60%, driving a ton at the rim, getting fouled a ton. He's hitting free throws at a rate similar to what he's done the past 2 seasons from basically mid-December on, because both seasons he's had like really bad starts over the first like month of the season, but from then on he's been closer to like a 65% free throw shooter. What if he just is this unstoppable driver of the basketball and is a good passer and improves on the rebounding? Like, it's not realistic to me to be like KJ is going to all of a sudden come in this season and shoot 30% from 3 on 2 attempts per game. Like, that's not realistic. Maybe the mid-range shots that we've seen him take a good amount of, maybe those go in a little bit more consistently. That could be part of it, and scoring a little bit more. And he ends up averaging 14 points, 6 rebounds per game, and 2.5 assists per game on really good efficiency. And he is even better in some of the little ways as well. Like, that would signify a good amount of improvement for KJ Adams. What about Zach Clemence coming back? Now, this one becomes interesting because technically it would be a second year of improvement in that what we would see. Like, for all we know, the most improved player, and I think Bill Self might have actually said this at like the banquet or something like that, was Zach Clemence last year. We just didn't get to see it. So Zach Clemence performs really well and ends up taking that backup center role, and maybe even is playing some minutes at the 4, and he's playing 10, 15 minutes a game, and he's hitting 36, 37% from 3, which is what you kind of thought you were going to get when he was coming in from the high school ranks. And he's holding his own on the defensive end and rebounding the basketball. And he's like a really good backup center for you that you are playing next to Hunter for a handful of minutes per game. That would signify a big jump, but how would you signify that based on last year? I don't actually think you could say Hunter Dickinson. Like, I know I mentioned earlier, like, hesitating on just kind of getting into the mode of he is who he is, but I feel like that is the case with Hunter Dickinson, and that's not a bad thing, because it's one thing to be like he is who he is when he's a all Big 12 third team player, which is still a very good player, but clearly there's room for growth. It's hard to be like, oh, you've been a first team All-American, like you've been a or whatever, you've been a multi-time All-American, you still got another level to go to. And I'm sure there are certain things, like clearly there are certain things Hunter Dickinson is trying to get better at. Like, can you have a more efficient season? Can you be more consistent 3-point shooting with KU? The defensive side of the basketball is obviously the big one there. But I think for the most part, like, Hunter is what he is. Now, maybe that would be where the improvement would come. What if Hunter becomes similar to what we saw with Udoka Azubuike in his final season, where Doak was more of a lumbering big man, and then his final season, he was like getting out and switching on guys and sticking with them in the mid-range and stuff. What if Hunter adds a little bit more in his pick-and-roll defense, in his overall defense? That could be real improvement. But in terms of what it's going to look like, the numbers, he averaged, he's probably going to average around the same amount of points and rebounds he averaged last season. Like, he's not going to be averaging 25 and 15 next season, So I guess it would be on the defensive end of the court with how that would be. Now, the newcomers, I don't know how you classify this with are they most improved because they weren't under your watch, but I still think you can monitor that. Like, AJ Storr to me is somebody who sticks out as he improved a lot from his freshman and sophomore season. What if the points go up even more this season? What if the efficiency goes up even more this season? What if the defense and the rebounding goes up this season? I think those latter two are ones that are going to be ones that Bill Self certainly harks on, that I kind of expect that to be the case. So I think he's going to be well-rounded and improved in a lot of ways. Ryland Griffin, this one, maybe it's improvement from just having an overall game or averaging even more points with Kansas. But I think with the adjustment in the scheme and what you're going to be asked to do, I don't know that this would be my pick. Shaquille Moore, you're looking at an older player coming in to play a specific role. I don't expect that to be the case. Hard to see like Zeke Mayo being the one unless you grade on a curve, because if you're viewing it from a statistical lens, he's not going to improve from his stats at South Dakota State to what his role is going to be asked to do at Kansas. But if you view it on a curve of, he's asked to, size down his role a little bit, tougher competition, could just his game internally take a big enough step up that he is so much better from where he was last year, or hypothetically, if he were still at South Dakota State, you would see that jump in the increase. I guess that is entirely possible. So who is my pick for who's going to be the most improved player and why? We'll get to that in just a moment on Locked On Jayhawks. This episode is brought to you by Game Time, an authorized ticket marketplace of Major League Baseball, which makes getting tickets faster and easier. Prices on the Game Time app actually go down the closer it gets to first pitch. They have killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and their lowest price guarantee, which means Game Time takes the guesswork out of buying MLB tickets. They have great features like zone deals where you might have a certain section that you're like, I'm cool sitting there. I don't really care what row or seat I'm going to be in. And you can save even more when you just do that with their zone deal where you choose a section and let Game Time choose the seats. They have their all-in pricing where you can toggle this feature and show total up front so you have no surprise fees at checkout. So take the guesswork out of buying MLB tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account, redeem code LOCKEDONCollege, LOCKEDONCOLLEGE for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. Thank you to the everydayers tuning into each and every show here on Locked On Jayhawks. And if you caught yesterday's episode, which I would go back and listen to, maybe listen to it again or watch it on our YouTube page, anywhere you get your podcast, with Phil Steele, where we previewed the KU football season with Phil Steele of Phil Steele's College Football Preview Magazine and talking a little Big 12 with Phil Steele. Also, tomorrow's episode of the show, we're going to get back to a KU Football Friday, and we're going to compare past Big 12 football champions and kind of look at where some of the benchmarks that KU football needs to get to for this season from a statistic element. Okay, so talking on today's edition about who's going to be the most improved player on this KU basketball team. So we went over some of the candidates and what would make them candidates for better or for worse for this. I think among the returning guys, my pick would be Dajuan Harris. I thought really hard about choosing KJ Adams, but as much as there's a chance for him to improve that way, there's also a chance the role gets sized down, right? What if you decide to play less of that kind of two big basketball and you play more of a wing at the four to where, you have more shooting on the floor, and that could have a impact in terms of losing a little bit on that role. So I ended up going with Dajuan Harris because I do think he's in for a bounce back. I think the roster is set up much better this season for KU, that they'll have much more three-point shooting. They'll have much more scoring around Dajuan, and that's where he can best excel. And we saw Dajuan last season really struggle around the rim and on layup opportunities. I think with more spacing, I think some of those shots will go in. Now, some of them he just point blank missed, and they weren't. It wouldn't have mattered if they had an extra three-point shooter on the floor. But I'm sure he's been in the gym kind of working on that. So I think Dajuan's, and if you just improve on those layups, you're probably another, half point per game that you're averaging. Like, I think Dajuan very well could average double-digit points per game in his final season with another year of work, more consistency from three. Maybe you're firing up another three-point attempt per game. We know the passing to turnover ratio is going to be there. Last year, there were some games, though, where it wasn't. You get back to where it was 2 years ago and kind of have that bounce back. And because you have more players that can kind of take the load on offense, I think that allows Dajuan to excel even more on the defensive end of the court and exert more energy there, where he was the Big 12 Defensive Player of the Year 2 years ago. Last year, he was still overall a good defender, but it wasn't that same level of being the best defender in the conference. Now, part of that was Jamal Shedd joined the conference and obviously was very good for Houston, but there were other parts of that too, which is just like he had so much to do on offense. He's playing so many minutes. It's hard to exert the same amount of energy and be as impactful on the defensive end as he was 2 years ago or 3 years ago. So I think this year, because you're going to be able to initiate offense with AJ Storr, because Hunter Dickinson's going to have the ball a lot, because even KJ can initiate certain offense out of the kind of short pick and roll, because Zeke Mayo and Shaquille Moore are going to be able to do some of those things. I think he's going to be better set up, that you'll see a much improved version of Dajuan statistically. I don't know how much better the statistics are going to be, but I think impact-wise, it will certainly be a big enough difference between what you're kind of getting there. And then I think if you're talking about the newcomers, like AJ Storr would be the one to me. I did actually consider like Shaquille Moore, even though he is an older veteran. Like, what if the 3-point shooting becomes more efficient? What if he is because his steal numbers were way better his previous 2 seasons than last year? Like, what if that reverts kind of in the same way that Dajuan? But I think my overall answer, not just among returnees, is AJ Storr, because he goes from averaging about 16 points, 3 rebounds per game a season ago, shoots 31% from 3. I think the 3-point shooting is going to go up. I think that's going to be closer to the mid-30s. So you're going to see a big improvement there. The scoring might be around the same, but you could convince me it's going to go up to 17, 18 per game. We saw Kevin McCullough, even with Hunter Dickinson, be around that mark. And so maybe AJ Storr gets to that mark with another year of college basketball. I think you're going to see the rebounding improve from AJ Storr. I think part of that was a little bit, of what you were asked to do. Like at Wisconsin, you're playing a slower tempo, also not a team that likes to crash the offensive glass. They like to send numbers back to transition. And they were playing like 2 traditional big men. They had like 6'9" power forward and like a 7-footer at center that they were playing down low, so they didn't need him to gobble up a ton of rebounds. Kansas, because you're playing with KJ, who hasn't been a great rebounder, like Storr's going to be asked to get a lot of rebounds, and especially if Storr's playing minutes at the 4, which I'm sure he will for Kansas when KJ is on the bench. So from that perspective, he's going to be asked to get a lot more rebounds, and I think he will, and I think so you'll get some improvement there on. And then beyond all that, I think Bill Self is very much going to demand, the defensive side of the ball, and I think that'll be a little bit better for AJ Storr, who's been close to an average defender. So can you be an above average defender this season? Even average at times, but in key moments above average. I think you're going to see a big improvement from AJ Storr from a season ago. And he was already a really good player. I'm expecting very high standards and very big things from what Storr's going to bring to the table for KU this upcoming season. All right, let's finish things up on this episode of Locked On Jayhawks. How many double-digit scores will Kansas have, and who will they be on LOJ? Thanks for joining us on today's episode of Locked On Jayhawks. Thank you to every dayers tuning in to each and every episode. Of course, you can check out all sorts of stuff going on across our Locked On podcast network. You can check out conference-wide. If you want to check out what's going on around the Big 12 or some of the other schools specifically, you can check out those shows. If you're into the NBA or NFL or MLB, you can check out our shows related to, you want to check out the Locked On Royals show or one of the other teams that you're interested in. You can find their podcast anywhere you get your podcasts and subscribe the same way that you can here with Locked On Jayhawks. So the question, how many double-digit scores will Kansas have on this year's team, and who will they be? Let's start here. Who are the locks to average double-digit scores? I mean, Hunter Dickinson and AJ Storr are getting double-digit points per game. Like, that is happening on this year's team, right? And they're going to be closer to 20 points per game than they probably are to 10 points per game. So those would be the ones that you feel great about. So that's 2 right off the bat with Storr and Dickinson. And if we just look at last year's team, again, that I mentioned, Kevin McCullough and Dickinson, both were around that 18 to 19 range. That could very well happen again with both this year. Who's close to a lock? Somebody that I wouldn't quite put in the locks, but I feel good about. I would put Ryland Griffin there. I guess it's possible that like Zeke Mayo ended up starting at the 2 or Shaquille Moore ended up starting at the 2 and then Ryland Griffin coming off the bench. That would impact things. And then maybe you're not projecting double-digit scoring. But I just think Ryland Griffin's going to get a lot of minutes. I think he'll be in the mid to upper 20 minutes per game, maybe even up to 30 minutes per game, depending on, some of the little things, the defense and the rebounding. But at the very least, we know he can shoot the basketball. We know he can score the basketball. I think he's a bit of an underrated passer and playmaker, and he will be very impactful for spacing the floor, for opening things up for guys like Hunter Dickinson and AJ Storr and KJ Adams on the inside. And so I think Ryland Griffin's going to get a lot of 3-point volume and opportunities, and I think he will average double-digit points for KU. I would say probably KJ Adams. He averaged 12 points last year. Even if the roll goes down a little bit, can he still get to 10 or more points per game? I think probably. There's also the chance that he is one of the more improved players that we talked about earlier. And what if he does get up to 13, 14 points per game? So I'd say probably KJ Adams gets up to that mark. This would be an interesting question. How many times has a KU player averaged double-digit points one season, came back for the next, and not averaged double-digit points per game? Maybe there's somebody out there who averaged like 10.5 and went down to 9.5 or something like that. But I don't know. I feel like that probably doesn't happen that often under Bill Self at KU. Maybe I'm forgetting about somebody. So hit me up at D Johnson Radio on Twitter if you can think of somebody who comes to mind there. If they play enough, I think they will get double-digit scoring, but I'm not entirely sure they will play enough. That would be Zeke Mayo. Now, if Zeke Mayo is playing 25 minutes per game, I would assume he's averaging double-digit points for you, somewhere between that 10 to 14 range. But what happens if Shaquille Moore is playing a ton of minutes and Dajuan's playing a ton of minutes and Zeke Mayo ends up only playing, 15, 18, 20 minutes per game? Could he be averaging closer to 7, 8, 9 points per game? Yes, that's absolutely possible. So he is a good scorer, but it's going to kind of come down to role if he gets enough shots, if he gets enough playing time. Leaning no, but he would be Dajuan Harris. I talked about earlier in the most improved, like, could he get up to 10 points per game? I still would say that odds would be he'd be closer to that under 10 points per game. Even if he averages more points than he did last season, maybe it's 9, 9.2, 9.5. And I guess that is a tight line, but I feel like if they were setting an over-under in like Vegas, it'd probably be like 9. So from that standpoint, leaning no, but I am open to the possibility that he could be averaging, in his final season, 10 and a half points per game. Maybe he does get a little bit more aggressive there in his final season. Unlikely, but possible. I would give to Shaquille Moore. If Shaquille ends up winning that starting 2 job, then it becomes even more possible because maybe you're playing 25 minutes per game. But, you've been right around that 9 point per game mark the past couple seasons. And that's with, getting a bigger role, I think, on the offensive end than he probably will be asked to do at Kansas. So I would not be picking him, but I understand it is possible and he's been close enough in the past. The rest I would say won't happen. Like Flory Badunga is not going to play enough minutes there. If Flory Badunga is playing 15 minutes per game, he's not going to average 10 points per game. If he does, then Kansas is going to be the best team in the country. Same with like Zach Clemence. He could be playing 10, 15 minutes a game. You're not going to average 10 points per game. Like that would be, you're going to play more minutes, first of all, and they're just not available. But that's not going to happen. It's not going to happen, unfortunately. Those players could both be very impactful, very good players, but you're not going to get to double-digit scoring. So that's not going to happen. I don't think Rakeem Passmore is going to play enough to do that. I do think Rakeem will be a nice surprise this season, but yeah. So that means the answer, we had 2 locks as part of this and a maximum of 7. So you're between 2 to 7 on the answer. I think the realistic answer is just saying between the group of I would lean 3 with Rylan Griffin. And then between the group of KJ Adams, Zeke Mayo, Dajuan Harris, probably one of those will get double digits. So I would say my guess would be 4 players will average double digits for Kansas this season, but realistically anything between like 3 to 5 is probably very possible for KU, which means they could have a very balanced scoring attack. All right, that'll do it for this episode of Locked On Jayhawks. We'll be back on Friday for a Football Friday, taking a look at past Big 12 champions on the football field and where KU compares, where they have to get to for certain benchmarks if they want to win the league this season. We'll see you next time with LOJ.